With so much conversation around reparations, one city has already passed a reparations program and started distributing funds. Evanston, Illinois, says it had planned to award $25,000 in reparations to eligible residents, but so far, 5 years later, after they had passed this plan, the city has only spent a little more than $300,000 of the $10 million that they had promised in 2019. My panel is back with me. So this is interesting. Evanston, Illinois decided that they wanted to do this. It was going to be $25,000 in housing grants. But now tonight, just tonight, they were talking about whether they should change it to a $25,000 cash payment to every eligible black resident. That has tax repercussions. So the housing grants made more sense for some people. And yet, they had been talking about this, LZ, since 2019. So not only is it a controversial and complicated topic to discuss, the devil's in the details. I mean, even Evanston, Illinois, that wants to do this is having a hard time. So far, only of 650 black residents who have applied in Evanston, 16 have received the money.
I knew all of them, all 16 of them. I used to be an adjunct at Northwestern University, so Evanston is a piece of Chicago that I think fondly of, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that they would want to try to do this. The execution of it, the clumsiness of it doesn't surprise me either, because it is a complicated conversation, but it's not a new conversation. It's a conversation that started hundreds of years ago, to be quite honest with you, because former slave owners, they got their reparations. So it's not as if this is a new word. It's not as if the government hasn't done this multiple times already. They just haven't done it for the people who actually deserve and earned the reparations yet. That's the difference.
Nicholas, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, reparations, ever since I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' big Atlantic article, I think it took up the whole issue that one time. I was like, whoa, I mean, it was a mind blower. And just for people who don't know exactly why anybody would cut a check like that, yeah, I mean, it's about, you read that article, it's like, okay, people in America build wealth by owning homes. They take that's their equity, they pass it on. That's the loan that they use to fund things. That's how kids go to college, even kids getting a loan to go to college. You know, black families in that part of the country and all over this country didn't get that opportunity. They had to live in different neighborhoods, they couldn't get in there. And so it's not to do with slavery, it's to do with that. And so, you know, logically, you look at it and you're like, that makes a lot of sense. It's always going to be very unpopular. I mean, it's very difficult politics.
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Right.
Black people want it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But we talked about how it's a democracy before, and at the end of the day, it's one of these very divisive issues, and people just kind of recoil from it. You know, you can go in and you make the case, and then people are like, oh, well, and, you know, it's just very divisive.
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think it's so divisive?
Why do you think it's so dramatically unpopular?
Well, you know, I looked at that stat, and it said that they had $10 million and it's $300,000 going out. And it's just sort of, it reminds me, you know, it's a very small thing, but it reminds me that like social programs get very popular when they're not means tested, when they're not for one group of people, but they're for everybody. And that, you know, you look at Social Security, obviously it's very popular.
But this is for everybody. And that's the point. To answer your question, the reason why it's not popular with white people, because as I just mentioned, the poll show it's popular with black people, is because the history, there's some gaps there in terms of understanding what the impact of slavery actually was. We made the joke about the Wall Street Journal. Well, there would be no Wall Street without black people. But a lot of Americans don't know that part of the history. They don't understand how important slavery was to financing banks at the early days of this country. And so when people don't have this information and they hear reparations, they think it's a handout. Well, no, actually it's a delayed check. And there's a clip, anyone can go Google it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. eloquently describes why reparations is important. And he talked about how this government helped white immigrants move west, gave them land, built colleges, help them understand how to till the land and actually grow and take care of themselves. But when it came to actual black people being released from slavery, we weren't given anything.
You don't even have to go that far back. You don't even have to go that far back, because redlining and housing discrimination was rampant in this country well into the 1980s. And in very diverse parts of the country that you wouldn't expect. Chevy Chase, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., a place I grew up, was established as a white enclave in the Articles of Incorporation for the town. They did not change that until 1980. I grew up a block away. And so, like, for families who have not only been excluded, but actually were, in many cases, they've had homes, real estate, et cetera, taken without compensation. There were cases in California oceanfront property that were owned by black families that were essentially just taken, and they were never given
the American
any.
dream? The American dream is owning your home, and then you get that, and then you can use that in all sorts of ways financially. People were barred from doing that in a way that.
I want to get Scott in. I know you're skeptical of this.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the reason it is so dramatically unpopular, you're correct about that, is because most people think it's fundamentally unfair and believe it's divisive and believe it's not the correct way for the country to atone for the issues that I think you have correctly described. I think you're 100% right about the history of this country, but the people that are living today don't feel like they're responsible for things that people did decades or hundreds of years ago.
What is the right way to atone?
Well, I think this country has made massive strides in race relations over the last
Sure, but
200 years.
financially.
Right, but that's not financial.
Oh, financially? Well, I told you last week, I don't believe any reparations program is ever going to be popular enough to be politically viable because most people don't think it is the correct way
Why
to
do you
deal with
keep
it.
saying most? Why do you keep saying most people when you know what we're talking about?
Because I can read a poll. Can you?
I can read a poll, but when you say most people, you make it sound as if there's not some variations there that's very easily identifiable. And I went back and I've done several research in terms of Gallup polls, and it's very clear there's a racial divide on this conversation. Right. And so when you say most people, what you really mean is like a lot of white people. And so let's be honest about this conversation.
Well, and the fairness
let's be honest about what kind of country we live in. We all live here together.
Yes.
And we don't make decisions based on one race gets to decide what to do to the other race or vice versa. We all make decisions together as Americans.
When did that start?
Americans.
When did that start?
And so when you're talking about, because one race wants to have something happen.
When did that start?
That's not the way it works.
I'm just curious. When did that start? This utopia that you just presented where race wasn't an impact in terms of people's lives, I'm curious, when did that start in this country?
I didn't describe America as a utopia, but right now.
Well, what did you say earlier?
But you seem to believe that in this country, based on race, we should have people of a certain race making policy decisions for everyone else. Do you think that's how
they do, because they're the majority of Congress. So that's actually the objective reality of
votes in the election.
that's a whole other
very
conversation.
I think it's interesting, Scott, what you were saying, that you do think that there needs to be an atonement, but Evanston is trying to do that.
Are you arguing that the United States of America hasn't made dramatic strides?
That's not the question.
Strides are different.
That's
over
not
the
the
history
question.
of this country?
The question is about financial impact of policy.
So what does atonement look to you? If it's not tied to finances, then what does it look like to you? I'm curious.
I think that this country needs to provide equality to every single American citizen. Equality
that's
of
a platitude.
opportunity.
Specifically.
No, it's not a platitude. It's a deeply held value for me and most Americans.
Okay, it's a value. How does that value play out legislatively? What does that look like? Because Evanston has something that's on paper that they're trying to execute. So your world, in terms of atonement, I'm just curious. What does that look like legislatively?
In a grand total of a whopping 16 people were able to take part in this fantastic idea.
But I'm asking you about your sense of atonement. If it's not going to be financial, then what do you think should be executed in order to reach this equality that you talk about?
I just told you that this country and its government ought to provide every American citizen equal opportunity to succeed.
Right, but you heard what Nicholas said about how in terms of a generational wealth and the accumulation of generational wealth, that hasn't happened. And so wouldn't it be helpful to be able to start by having some sort of housing grant?
Would it be helpful to just redistribute all the wealth? Is that what you're arguing for?
No,
it's not the same thing.
You're gaslighting the conversation. That's actually really legitimate.
But everybody at this table is for redistributing.
No.
Wealth.
Hold on a second.
Except for me, and I'm the only one in the majority of any survey. Any survey. It's not even close.
That's not fair. But you made a really important point, I think, which is about what Americans do and don't understand about what's actually happened. And that is at the core what the reparations conversation has always been, which is that we have been, and we are having this conversation every week about how much of our history now we're trying to erase from school curriculums, et cetera. The fact is that African Americans have been systemically, consistently excluded from the ability to build wealth for decades. And there should be a serious conversation about what that means for them and about how we solve that problem, not just with platitudes, to LZ's point, but with policy.
On that note, thank you all for this conversation, and we'll be right back.